The barn had always been my escape from loneliness until one night, when a simple moment with our horse took an unexpected turn, leaving me questioning everything I thought I knew about trust, boundaries, and my own desires. I know it sounds strange, but I have to admit it started innocently enough. Or at least that's what I told myself at first. My husband was away on another business trip, and the house felt too quiet, too empty, seeking comfort. I wandered out to the barn like I had so many times before. Apollo, our magnificent chestnut gelding, had always been a calming presence, a source of peace in my otherwise routine life. But that evening, something felt different, a shift I couldn't quite explain. In the quiet of the barn, I crossed a line I never thought I would, one that blurred the boundaries of trust, loyalty, and who I believed I was. Our relationship, my husband's and mine, had always been one of routine, predictability, and comfort. He worked long hours in his corporate job, often away on business trips, and I stayed at home. We had built a life together that was filled with mundane moments, dinners, quiet weekends, long nights spent in front of the TV. But beneath the surface, something was missing. It wasn't something I could pinpoint immediately, but over time, the distance between us seemed to grow. That's when I turned to our horse. We had always had horses on our property. It was a piece of land far away from the bustle of the city, a place where we could breathe. The barn was well kept, and the field stretched out like a quiet oasis. My husband loved the horses, and I could tell they brought him peace. But they never seemed to be more than just a hobby to him. For me, though, the animals were a connection to something deeper, a way to escape the monotony of my everyday life. I would often visit the barn, feed the horses, and enjoy their company when my husband was away. That's how it started. You see, the relationship that I never expected. I remember the first time I walked into the barn alone, while my husband was away on one of his business trips. The air was crisp, the scent of hay and earth filling my nostrils. There, standing in the stall, was a large, beautiful gelding named Apollo. He was magnificent, with a glossy chestnut coat that glowed in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the barn windows. His eyes were a deep, soulful brown that seemed to watch me with curiosity. I had never been particularly close to him before. He was always my husband's horse, after all. But that day, I felt a strange pull toward him, an unexpected connection. I hesitated for a moment, standing by the stall door, just watching him. He lowered his head, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air around me. Slowly, cautiously, I stepped closer. "Hey there," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth, but there was something about him that made me want to speak to him, as though he could understand. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt an instant trust from him. Apollo was his name, and he seemed to recognize the vulnerability in me, just as I recognized the same in him. Over the following days, I began to spend more time in the barn. Each time my husband was away, I would go out to visit Apollo. I'd brush his coat, clean his hooves, and sometimes I'd just sit beside him in the quiet of the barn. I couldn't tell you why, but I began to feel a sense of peace whenever I was with him, an emotional release that I had longed for in my own life. And so the days passed. My husband's trips became longer, and I found myself growing more and more connected to Apollo. It was as though he understood my unspoken feelings. His presence brought me comfort, and when I rode him, it felt like I was escaping into a world where nothing else mattered. The rhythmic motion of his gallop became my solace, the wind in my hair, the pounding of hooves beneath me. It was like nothing I had ever experienced before. But then one day, something shifted. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just a quiet moment in the barn. I had spent the afternoon riding, and as I came back to untuck him, something inside me urged me to stay. I didn't want to leave him. I couldn't explain it, but there was a strange longing inside me that I couldn't push away. As I ran my hands over Apollo's sleek coat, I felt a surge of warmth, something beyond the simple connection we had built over the past few weeks. Without thinking, I moved closer to him, my hands lingering longer than usual. He didn't pull away. And in fact, he seemed to lean into my touch, his body responding to mine in a way I hadn't expected. It was subtle at first, a nudge, a shift in position, but I felt it. The energy between us, a silent understanding. That was when I knew. I know how strange it sounds, how impossible it must seem to anyone who hasn't been there. But I could feel Apollo's presence in my every fiber. It was as if he had become an extension of me, his thoughts and mine entwining in some inexplicable way. It wasn't about lust. Not at first. But there was a tension, an undeniable charge that hung in the air whenever we were together. I tried to ignore it, to push it down, but it was always there. Every time my husband was gone, I found myself drawn back to the barn, drawn to Apollo. The nights alone in the house grew colder, emptier. I would sit in the quiet, listening to the wind outside, and waiting for my husband to return. But even when he was home, the distance between us seemed to widen. I couldn't talk to him the way I could talk to Apollo. He didn't understand my silences, my needs. But Apollo, he understood without a single word. One night, after a particularly long day, I found myself in the barn again, unable to resist the pull. I had tried to ignore it, tried to focus on other things, but the ache in my chest grew unbearable. Apollo was waiting for me. I went straight to him. No hesitation now, no second thoughts. It was dark, the barn lit only by the soft glow of the moonlight filtering in through the cracks in the walls. Apollo was there, standing patiently, as though he had been waiting for me all along. I could feel his gaze on me, steady and sure, and for a moment, I just stood there, breathing in the night air, trying to calm my racing heart. And that's when it happened. I can't say exactly what led to it, but as I reached out to touch Apollo's mane, something shifted between us. The connection was no longer just emotional. It was deeper, and suddenly, I realized I had crossed a line. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. What was I doing? What had I just done? But the truth was, I didn't want to stop. I wasn't sure why, but in that moment, I couldn't deny that Apollo and I shared something that was beyond explanation, something that had taken root in me and was impossible to ignore. It didn't end there. It wasn't a fleeting moment. It was the beginning of something I couldn't escape, something that grew with each day that passed. As my husband continued to be away on business trips, I found myself returning to the barn again and again. I didn't know what to call it all. I only knew that I couldn't stay away. But the story didn't end there. The first time I crossed the line, I thought it was a mistake. I thought it would be a one-time thing, something I'd regret and bury deep inside, hoping no one would ever know. I tried to convince myself that I was simply confused, that the loneliness of my life had clouded my judgment. But that was the problem. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't confusion. It was a need, a deep visceral need that grew with every visit to the barn. Apollo was no longer just a horse. He had become my secret, my escape, my obsession. His presence haunted me, even when I wasn't with him. In the quiet moments of my day, when I was alone in the house, I'd think of him, of the way his coat gleamed in the sunlight, of how his muscles rippled beneath his skin when he moved. I could almost feel the heat of him, the way he responded to me. The connection between us was undeniable, like a magnet pulling me toward him, no matter how much I tried to resist. It wasn't just the physical closeness that drew me in. It was the silence. The space between us seemed to speak louder than words. Apollo didn't need to say anything to make me feel seen, understood, and wanted. He knew. He felt it. Every touch, every glance shared between us was enough to send a wave of heat through my body, and I couldn't stop it, no matter how many times I tried to tell myself that I was being ridiculous, that I was just lonely, that I needed to pull myself together. I kept returning to the barn. It wasn't even that my husband was gone. Yes, he was frequently away on business, but I still had my own life to live. I could have gone out with friends. I could have focused on hobbies or even picked up work again. But the truth was, I didn't want anyone else. I didn't want the company of people. I didn't want to fill the void with something that didn't matter. I wanted Apollo. That night, after everything had changed between us. I couldn't sleep. My husband had just returned from a week-long trip, and though I was happy to see him, there was a part of me that felt hollow as he lay beside me in bed. His steady breathing seemed to only amplify the chaos in my mind. I couldn't focus. The rhythm of Apollo's movements, the warmth of his body, it all replayed in my head like a film on repeat. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him, and found myself standing by the window, staring out at the barn in the distance. The moonlight bathed the field in a soft glow, and for a moment, I felt torn between the life I had built with my husband and the strange new world I had begun to carve out with Apollo. I had been back from the barn for hours, but my body still tingled. My skin still hummed with the memory of what had transpired. Apollo's presence seemed to linger in the air, the bond between us pulsing with a rhythm all its own. I tried to push it away, but it wouldn't let me. There was no escaping it now. I went back to the bed, my movements slow, as if in a trance. I could hear my husband's quiet breathing, his back turned to me, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside of me. The silence between us felt suffocating. I had always believed in the love we shared, but now it felt like something distant. The emotional void I had tried to ignore was becoming impossible to ignore anymore. My husband was a good man. He didn't deserve this. But at that moment, I couldn't care less. The next day, I waited for the opportunity. My husband had plans to meet with a colleague, leaving me alone again with only the sounds of the house and the fields outside as company. I didn't know what it was that drove me to it. Perhaps it was the way Apollo's gaze burned into me whenever I was near him. Or maybe it was just the irresistible pull of a desire I had been trying to bury for so long. But I didn't hesitate. As soon as I knew my husband was gone, I made my way to the barn. I moved quickly, as if something deep inside me knew that if I slowed down, I might stop. And I couldn't stop. Not now. I found Apollo waiting for me, just as he always did. His coat was sleek, his muscles shifting beneath his skin as he turned toward me. His eyes locked onto mine, and I swear I could see the same longing in them that I felt in my chest. I didn't say anything. Words didn't seem necessary anymore. I walked toward him, my breath shallow, my heart pounding. My hands trembled as I reached for him, and when I touched his mane, a jolt of electricity shot through me. I couldn't explain it, but it was as though every nerve in my body was alive, every fiber of my being attuned to him. He nickered softly, as if inviting me closer, and I didn't hesitate. My hands roamed over his coat, the warmth of his body seeping into my fingers. My skin prickled with sensation. The world outside the barn seemed to fade away as I focused entirely on him. I didn't know what came over me, but I didn't want to fight it. I didn't want to stop. I couldn't stop. The barn was silent, except for the soft sound of Apollo's breath, the rustling of his mane under my fingers. The tension between us grew palpable and thick. I moved closer, pressing my body against his side, feeling the heat radiating from him. His warmth seemed to seep into me, and I couldn't pull away. I didn't want to. Apollo shifted, turning his head to nuzzle my neck, his breath warm against my skin. The sensation sent a wave of heat coursing through me, and I gasped, surprised by how it made me feel. I wanted more. Without thinking, I reached up to touch his face, my fingers grazing his lips. And that's when it happened. Apollo leaned in, his nostrils flaring, and I swear I could feel his heartbeat echoing against mine. For a moment, everything felt suspended in time. The world outside the barn ceased to exist. I don't know what happened after that. I don't know where the line blurred, but suddenly I wasn't just standing there anymore. My body pressed closer to his, my hands moving in ways I couldn't explain. The sensation of his muscles beneath my touch made my breath catch in my throat, and I couldn't stop myself. I was lost in it, consumed by it. Every instinct inside of me screamed for more, for something I couldn't put into words. There was no going back now. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, I realized what I had done. My chest was heaving, my breath ragged in the stillness of the barn. The warmth of Apollo's body seemed to fill every inch of the space around me, and I felt exposed. vulnerable. I pulled away, my heart hammering in my chest, my body trembling with the aftershocks of what had just happened. But I knew one thing for sure, there was no turning back. The line I had crossed wasn't just a physical one. It was a line in my heart, in my mind, a line that had been erased. And I didn't know how to find it again. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The way my body had responded to Apollo. The way his presence had flooded my senses. I tried to push it down, to convince myself that it was just a fleeting moment of madness. But it wasn't. The connection between us had only deepened. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more it consumed me. My husband had gone away again, leaving me alone with my thoughts and with Apollo. He couldn't have known that even when he was home, I wasn't really there anymore. My mind was consumed with thoughts of that barn, of Apollo's presence, his warmth, the way he made me feel in ways I couldn't describe. It was as if a part of me had awakened that I didn't even know existed, and I couldn't silence it. The days felt like a blur, and every moment I wasn't with him, I found myself yearning for it. The feeling of Apollo's breath against my skin, the warmth of his body pressing against mine. It was all I could think about. I began to visit the barn every day, even when my husband was around. I'd make excuses, tell him I needed some fresh air, a walk, or just a quiet moment to myself. I couldn't let him know the truth of what was happening inside me. And the truth was, I needed Apollo more than I needed anything else. There was a pull between us now, something undeniable. Every time I walked into that barn, I felt like I was stepping into a world where only Apollo and I existed. A world where the noise of the outside world, the expectations of my life, faded away. But this time, when I arrived at the barn, something felt different. Apollo wasn't in the stall where he usually stood, waiting for me with his gentle eyes. I called out his name, my voice soft but full of urgency. He always responded when I called. But tonight, there was silence. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. Had something happened to him? I rushed through the barn, opening the doors to each stall, hoping to find him. Finally, I heard him. His low whinny echoed through the barn, and I followed the sound until I found him standing near the far end of the stable. He was just standing there, his head lowered, as though deep in thought. When he saw me, his eyes brightened, and he trotted over to me, his hooves making a rhythmic sound on the hard floor. For a moment, I stood frozen, watching him come closer, and then he reached me, nuzzling me gently with his nose, as though reassuring me that everything was okay. I reached up to touch his mane, my hands trembling with the intensity of the emotions flooding through me. His warmth seemed to radiate through me, and I closed my eyes, just standing there, feeling the moment. But I wasn't just standing there. Something inside me was shifting again, a quiet desire, a need I couldn't push away. I let out a shaky breath as I gently stroked his neck, the muscle beneath my fingers rippling with every movement. The closeness between us was palpable, the air thick with unspoken understanding. It felt as though the space between us was closing, as though Apollo and I were becoming one in some way that went beyond the physical. I couldn't explain it, but in that moment, it was as though we were connected on a level I had never felt before. The emotional bond between us had grown so deep that it was hard to differentiate where I ended and where Apollo began. He seemed to respond to every thought, every feeling that ran through my mind. And in turn, I became attuned to his every movement, his every breath. It was as if we were communicating without words, a silent understanding that grew stronger with each passing moment. I moved closer to him, my hand trailing down his side as I pressed my body against his. The warmth of his body seemed to melt away any lingering doubts or hesitation I had. There was no need for words. There was only us. Only the quiet bond that tied us together. I had long since stopped questioning why this was happening. There was no point in trying to understand it anymore. Apollo shifted, moving so that his chest was pressed gently against mine, and I felt a strange rush of emotion flood through me. His breath was warm against my skin, and I closed my eyes, feeling the sensation spread through my body. My hands ran over his coat, the smoothness of his muscles beneath the skin sending a wave of warmth through me. I could feel my heartbeat accelerating, the tension between us growing with each passing second. I had never felt so alive. It wasn't just the physical closeness, though that was undeniable. It was the emotional intensity, the feeling that I had found something that transcended the mundane. Apollo was no longer just an animal to me. He was my equal. He understood me in ways that no one else could. And in return, I understood him in ways that no one else would ever be able to. His gaze locked with mine again, and I felt an electric current pass between us, the connection between us deepening in a way that was almost frightening. I could feel his warmth, his energy, his life force, and it felt as though I had merged with him. For a brief moment, I was no longer just me, I was we. I moved instinctively, my hands reaching for him, pulling him closer to me. His body responded, pressing against mine with a gentle force that made my heart race. Every inch of him seemed to burn with an intensity that mirrored my own desire. He was no longer just a presence beside me, he was part of me, and I was part of him. I couldn't deny the pull anymore. The tension that had been building between us quietly over the past few weeks had finally come to a head. But just as quickly as the intensity flared, something inside me pulled back. I stood there, my body trembling, my breath shallow. As I realized what I was doing, the guilt came rushing in, a wave of shame that hit me like a cold bucket of water. What was I doing? What had I become? I pulled away from Apollo, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't look at him for a moment. The guilt, the fear, the sense that I had crossed an irreparable line overwhelmed me. I stumbled back, my hands shaking as I wiped my face, trying to clear the fog from my mind. I had no words, no explanation for what was happening between us. But in that silence, Apollo seemed to understand. He didn't move away from me. Instead, he stood there watching me with those deep, knowing eyes, as though he could feel the storm raging inside me. I didn't know how to stop. I didn't know how to turn away from this strange, twisted connection that had formed between us. And I didn't know how to go back to the way things were before. Because no matter how hard I tried to convince myself that I could, I knew deep down that I was no longer the person I once was. I was someone else entirely. Someone who had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And the most terrifying part? I didn't know if I ever wanted to go back. I was spiraling, lost in a world I couldn't navigate. The pull between me and Apollo was undeniable, but it came with a darkness I couldn't escape. It was as if I had willingly walked into a maze with no exit, with no way to undo what I had allowed to happen. And the worst part was that every part of me, every part of my body, my mind, my soul, was desperately pulling me back deeper into that maze, deeper into Apollo's orbit. The guilt at times was overwhelming, but there were other times, moments when Apollo stood close to me, when he nuzzled my neck or brushed against me with his soft, warm body, that the guilt faded. It seemed insignificant in comparison to the magnetic pull that now existed between us. When he was near, I wasn't reminded of the life I had left behind, the promises I had made, the vows I had taken. When I was with him, everything seemed to make sense in a way that the world around me could never. There was no noise, no judgment, just us. But the tension was rising. I could feel it in my bones. It wasn't just the growing closeness between Apollo and me. It was the realization that I couldn't keep living in this secret world forever. There were days when I was caught between the need to keep pretending everything was normal and the urge to completely abandon that false reality. The facade I had built with my husband was growing more fragile with each passing day. I had managed to keep up appearances for a while, lying to myself and lying to him. When he came back from his trips, I pretended everything was fine, but I knew he had started to notice something in my eyes, a shift that couldn't be hidden anymore. I couldn't mask the way my body seemed to hum with energy whenever I was near Apollo, the way I would zone out, lost in thoughts that had nothing to do with him. One evening, my husband came to me, his expression serious. He'd been quiet for days, watching me from the corner of his eye with a look I couldn't place. The questions hung in the air between us like a thick fog, suffocating everything. He leaned against the door frame, his eyes searching mine. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low but filled with an unsettling calm. I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting in knots. I had no idea how to answer. Part of me wanted to confess everything, the truth that I had been hiding, the secret world I had built with Apollo, the way I had betrayed him. But another part of me couldn't bring myself to shatter the illusion. "I don't know what you mean," I said, my voice sounding far more distant than I intended. I cursed myself for the way my heart raced, the way my hands trembled just slightly. He studied me for a long moment before pushing away from the door frame. His gaze didn't leave me as he stepped closer. His voice was now quieter, tinged with concern. "I've been giving you space because I thought you needed it. But this isn't you. You've been different." I had no answer. I felt like a stranger to myself, disconnected from the life I had once known. The woman I used to be, the part of me that had once been his wife, seemed to have faded, lost in a world that no longer fit. "I've been fine," I finally said, forcing the words out, even as they felt like lies. Just a little stressed. But he wasn't convinced. He watched me for another moment. And then, almost as though he had made a decision, he turned and left the room without another word. The silence that followed was deafening. I heard him downstairs pacing the kitchen, and I knew he was trying to figure it out, trying to piece together the pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. I wanted to leave. I wanted to escape, to run to the barn, to be with Apollo, where nothing mattered but the heat of his body and the silence between us. But I couldn't. Not yet. The days grew colder, and I found myself retreating further into myself. I stopped pretending. I stopped fighting it. The pull to Apollo was all-consuming now. It was becoming impossible to function without him. And then it happened. It was a late afternoon when my husband left for a meeting, and I made my way to the barn once more. I knew what I was doing. I knew the consequences of it, but there was no turning back. Apollo greeted me as he always did, and I found myself standing there, staring into his deep brown eyes, unable to look away. The connection between us seemed to shimmer in the air. I could feel his energy, his presence, his quiet power surrounding me. I walked toward him, my hands trembling as I reached out to touch his mane. But this time, something was different. This time, there was a certain intensity in the air, a knowing between us that hadn't been there before. As I ran my fingers through his mane, I felt the tension in my body release, the rush of desire washing over me. My mind couldn't process it anymore. The thoughts too chaotic, the emotions too raw. Suddenly, I heard a noise, footsteps. My heart stopped, and a rush of panic surged through me. I pulled away quickly, my breath coming in short gasps as I glanced around the barn. But it wasn't the sound of my husband. It was something else, something that made me freeze in place. Apollo's eyes were wide, his body tense. But the quiet connection between us didn't break. It was as though time had stopped, the world waiting, holding its breath. And then I heard it, the sound of the barn door creaking open, the unmistakable voice of my husband. He was home early. My blood ran cold. I had been caught, not physically, but emotionally. There was no going back from this moment. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. My heart pounded in my chest as I heard him approach the barn, each step echoing in my mind like a countdown. There was no longer any pretending, no more hiding behind lies. I could feel the weight of the truth settling around me, the consequences of my actions finally catching up to me. When my husband stepped into the barn, I didn't look at him. I couldn't. He stood in the doorway, silent for a long moment. And then I heard him speak. I knew something was wrong, he said, his voice low but steady. I didn't want to believe it, but now I understand. I turned to face him, my heart heavy with shame. The man I had promised myself to, the man I had once loved with everything I had, was standing there, and I had betrayed him in the worst possible way. I never wanted this, I whispered, the words barely escaping my lips. But it happened. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The pain in his eyes told me everything. There was no easy way to fix what had been broken. There was no way to erase what had happened between Apollo and me. The story had come to its tragic, irreversible end, and there was no undoing the damage I had caused. My world had shifted, twisted, and broken in ways I couldn't comprehend. And in that moment, as the silence between us stretched, I realized that no matter what came next, there was no going back to what I had once known. Everything had changed,